The rain began as a rhythmic tapping against the bay window of their suburban home, a steady, hypnotic pulse that seemed to sync with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Inside, the house smelled of freshly ground Arabica and the faint, citrusy tang of the expensive floor wax Sarah insisted on using every Sunday. To any outsider looking through the glass, Mark and Sarah Grayson were the embodiment of the modern dream, a tastefully decorated colonial, 2 steady careers, and 5 years of marriage that had never once been marred by a raised voice or a slammed door. Mark sat at the kitchen island, his fingers wrapped around a warm mug, watching his wife move through the house with the precision of a clockwork doll. Sarah was a woman of systems. She didn't just pack, she engineered. Her suitcase, a sleek, hard-shell Tumi in charcoal gray, lay open on their Egyptian cotton sheets like a gaping mouth, waiting to be filled with the armor of her corporate life. Napa is going to be chilly this time of year, even for a retreat, Mark remarked, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet kitchen. Did you pack that cashmere wrap I got you for Christmas? Sarah didn't look up from her task. She was folding a silk blouse with such exactness that the sleeves looked ironed into place by gravity alone. I did, honey. And the weather forecast says it's mostly indoor seminars anyway. Leadership in the digital age. It's going to be a lot of PowerPoint and very little vineyard time, unfortunately. She offered him a small, practiced smile, the kind she used for clients. It was bright, symmetrical, and didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes. Mark felt a tiny, inexplicable shiver. He'd seen that smile 1,000 times, but today, under the gray light of a rainy Tuesday, it felt different. It felt like a mask that was beginning to itch. 5 days is a long time for a leadership retreat, Mark said, trying to keep his tone light. The house feels too big when you're not here. Sarah finally paused, a pair of dark slacks draped over her arm. She walked over to him, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. She smelled of her signature perfume, sandalwood and bergamot, but beneath it, Mark caught the sharp, metallic scent of nervous sweat. Her hand rested on his shoulder for a second too long, her thumb tracing the line of his collarbone in a way that felt more like a goodbye than a see you later. It's just 5 days, Mark. Think of it as a chance to finally finish that woodworking project in the garage without me complaining about the sawdust, she teased. But her eyes were darting toward her phone, which lay face down on the counter. It had been vibrating intermittently all morning, a dull thrum-thrum that she had ignored with studied indifference. The Uber notification chirped. That's me, she said, her voice rising an octave. The calmness she had maintained all morning suddenly spiked into a frantic energy. She snapped the suitcase shut with a definitive click-click. Mark stood up to help her with the bags, but she was already grabbing the handle. I've got it. It's light. Stay here, stay dry. No point in both of us getting soaked in the driveway. He followed her to the foyer anyway. As she reached for her trench coat, her gaze lingered on the framed photograph hanging by the door. It was from their wedding day, a candid shot of them laughing under a canopy of oak trees, Sarah's white veil caught in a sudden gust of wind. For a heartbeat, her expression crumbled. The mask slipped. A look of profound, agonizing guilt washed over her features, making her look 10 years older. Sarah. Mark reached out, his hand hovering near her waist. Are you okay? You look pale. She blinked, and the mask snapped back into place. Just pre-trip jitters. Big presentation on Thursday. I love you, Mark. I love you too. Call me when you land. Of course. She stepped out into the rain. Mark stood in the open doorway, watching the black sedan pull away from the curb. She didn't look back. She didn't wave. She just stared straight ahead, her silhouette framed by the rear window until the red glow of the tail lights vanished around the corner. The house felt instantly hollow. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind, it was the heavy, expectant silence of a theater after the final curtain has fallen. Mark sighed, closing the door and locking it. He headed back upstairs to the bedroom, intending to make the bed and reclaim some sense of order. The room still carried her scent. On her side of the bed, the duvet was kicked back, a stray strand of her long, dark hair caught on the pillowcase. As he pulled the sheets taut, his foot brushed against something hard and small near the base of the nightstand. He reached down and pulled out a stray sock, one of her thick, wool hiking socks. But as he picked it up, he felt a weight inside it. He frowned, reaching into the toe of the sock. His fingers closed around a small, square object wrapped in velvet. He pulled it out. It was a jewelry box from an upscale boutique in the city, one Sarah usually avoided because she found their prices pretentious. Mark felt a surge of warmth. A surprise. He thought. Maybe she felt bad about the long trip and bought me something? He flipped the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a pair of heavy, platinum cufflinks. They were stunning, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and bordered by tiny, paved diamonds. They were far more formal than anything Mark wore to his mid-sized accounting firm. He lifted one out to admire the craftsmanship, and that's when he saw it. Engraved on the back of the toggle, in a delicate, flowing script, were two letters, JW. Mark's breath hitched. His heart, which had been beating with steady, domestic rhythm, suddenly leaped into his throat. His mind raced through their social circle. James. No. John. No. They didn't know anyone with the initials JW. He turned the cufflink over and over in his hand. The weight of the metal felt like lead. He remembered the way Sarah had looked at their wedding photo. He remembered the Project Moon folder he'd caught a glimpse of on her laptop weeks ago, which she'd closed the moment he entered the room, claiming it was a new rebranding campaign for a lunar-themed tech startup. He looked at the empty suitcase stand in the corner. He looked at the rain-streaked window. Sarah was a woman of systems. She didn't make mistakes. She didn't leave expensive gifts behind by accident. Unless, in her rush to leave for a leadership retreat in Napa, she had forgotten the one thing she needed for a very different kind of ceremony. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, the JW cufflinks biting into his palm. The business trip had only begun 20 minutes ago, but as the rain turned into a downpour, Mark knew with a sickening certainty that the woman who had just left would never truly be coming back. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful, it was a physical weight, pressing against Mark's chest as he sat on the edge of their bed, the JW cufflinks still clutched in his palm. The rain continued its mournful drumming against the roof, but the rhythmic sound now felt like a countdown. 5 years of marriage, 1,825 days of shared meals, whispered secrets, and plans for a future that, only an hour ago, had felt as solid as the foundation of their home now seemed like a holographic projection, flickering at the edges. He looked at the cufflinks again. Platinum. Diamond encrusted. Expensive enough to be an heirloom, or a wedding gift. JW. The initials mocked him. He tried to force his brain to find a logical explanation. A client? A boss? A brother she never mentioned? None of it fit Sarah's meticulous nature. She didn't buy $1,000 gifts for clients and hide them in her sock drawer. Mark stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the nightstand. That's when he saw it. Tucked under a copy of a celebrity gossip magazine she usually claimed to be above reading was her iPad Pro. His heart did a strange, jagged hop. Sarah never went anywhere without her iPad. It was her digital lifeblood, her calendars, her presentations, her connection to the corporate world she moved through so effortlessly. Leaving it behind wasn't just a mistake, it was a glitch in the matrix. He picked it up. The glass was cold. He tapped the screen, and it bloomed into life, showing a high-resolution photo of a sunset they'd watched together in Maui 3 years ago. The irony felt like a slap. Enter passcode. Mark hesitated. He felt a sudden, Sharp pang of guilt. They had a no secrets policy, but they also respected each other's privacy. He had never once felt the need to snoop. But as his thumb hovered over the screen, he looked back at the cufflinks on the bed. The guilt vanished, replaced by a cold, numbing resolve. He typed in 0-6-1-2 June 12th. Their wedding anniversary. The screen shifted instantly. The home screen was cluttered with folders, but a notification banner was draped across the top. It was an automated email from an airline. Your flight to Charleston is ready for check-in. Mark's breath hitched. Charleston. She was supposed to be in San Francisco, heading north to Napa Valley. Why would she be flying to South Carolina? He opened the mail app. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. He searched for the word Napa. No results found. He searched for San Francisco. No results found. He searched for Charleston. A deluge of emails appeared. Dozens of them. They weren't from her marketing firm. They were from names like Low Country Floral Designs, the Gastronomy Group, and the Magnolia Estate. Mark scrolled through them, his eyes darting across the text, his mind struggling to process the information. He found a confirmation for a catering menu, filet mignon, lobster tail, champagne toast for 150 guests. He found a PDF attachment for a seating chart. Table 1, the bride's family. Bride. Mark whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He exited the mail app and went straight to the Photos app. He scrolled past their recent vacation photos, past pictures of their dog, and toward the bottom of the album's list. There, hidden behind a folder titled Project Moon, was a password-protected album. He tried the anniversary again. Incorrect. He tried her birthday. Incorrect. He tried his own birthday. Incorrect. A memory flashed in his mind a night 2 months ago when she'd been giggling at her phone and mentioned a college nickname an old flame had given her. July. He typed in 0-7-0-7. The folder swung open. It wasn't a collection of work documents. It was a digital shrine. Hundreds of photos of Sarah with a man Mark recognized instantly. Julian Whitlock. The JW. From the cufflinks. Julian was a man Mark had heard of only in passing, a wealthy, charismatic developer Sarah had dated briefly in her early 20s. She'd always described him as arrogant and unstable, a mistake of her youth. But the photos told a different story. These weren't old photos. The metadata on the most recent one, a shot of them kissing on a balcony overlooking the Charleston harbor, was dated just 3 weeks ago, during her last business trip to Chicago. Mark felt a wave of nausea so powerful he had to sit on the floor. He scrolled further. There were photos of Sarah in wedding dresses, not the one she had worn for him, but something more extravagant, more modern. There were screenshots of text messages between her and Julian. I can't wait for Saturday, my love, Julian had written. Finally, no more hiding. No more Mark. Just us. Sarah's reply, he has no idea. He thinks I'm at a retreat. I'll be your wife in every sense of the word by sunset. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark wasn't just being cheated on. He was being erased. Sarah wasn't just having an affair, she was staging a total replacement of her life. She had forged a reality where he didn't exist, or where he was merely a placeholder until her real life could resume. He looked at the Project Moon folder again. He realized now that Moon was short for honeymoon. There were flight itineraries for a 2-week trip to the Amalfi Coast, departing from Charleston on Sunday night. A cold, hard anger began to crystallize in Mark's gut, replacing the shock. He was a man who worked with numbers, he liked things to balance. The math of his life was currently a glaring, red deficit. He had given her everything: loyalty, a home, his heart, and she was using his own wedding anniversary as the passcode to her betrayal. He stood up and walked to his own closet. He pulled out a dusty suitcase from the top shelf. He didn't pack like Sarah. He didn't engineer. He threw in a suit, a few shirts, and his passport. He went back to the iPad and looked at the confirmation for the grand ballroom at the Magnolia Estate. Saturday at 6 p.m. "You want a wedding, Sarah?" Mark said to the empty, quiet room. His voice was steady, devoid of the tremor from moments ago. "I'll make sure it's an event you'll never forget." He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He didn't book a flight to Napa. He searched for the earliest flight to Charleston, South Carolina. There was one leaving in 4 hours. As he clicked confirm purchase, a sense of surreal calm washed over him. He looked at the wedding photo by the door, the one Sarah had looked at with such guilt before she left. He realized now it wasn't guilt he had seen in her eyes. It was pity. She was pitying the man who would be left behind in a house full of lies. Mark grabbed his keys and the JW cufflinks. He tucked the velvet box into his pocket. He would return them to the owner personally. He walked out of the house, leaving the lights on and the door unlocked. It didn't matter. Everything inside that house was a lie anyway. As he drove through the rain toward the airport, the perfect husband was gone. In his place was a man who had nothing left to lose, heading toward a wedding where he was the only guest who knew the truth. The humidity of Charleston hit Mark like a physical wall the moment he stepped out of the air-conditioned sanctuary of the airport terminal. It was a thick, heavy heat, smelling of salt marsh, blooming jasmine, and the ancient, damp stone of a city that had seen centuries of secrets. To the tourists streaming past him in linen shirts and sun hats, it was the smell of a romantic getaway. To Mark, it felt like the breath of a fever. He leaned against a concrete pillar, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his suitcase. In his pocket, the velvet box containing the JW cufflinks felt like a hot coal. He hadn't slept on the flight. He had spent 3 hours staring at the seat back in front of him, replaying every business trip Sarah had taken over the last 2 years. Every late-night work call, every dead battery, every exhausting seminar that left her too tired to talk. The math was finally adding up, and the sum was 0. He was the remainder, the part of the equation that was no longer needed. He rented a nondescript silver sedan, something that would blend into the background of a parking lot. As he drove toward the historic district, the city's beauty felt grotesque. The grand, rainbow-colored houses of East Bay Street and the swaying Spanish moss on the live oak seemed like a stage set, a beautiful facade hiding a rotten foundation. He followed the GPS toward the Magnolia Estate. It was located 20 miles outside the city center, a sprawling plantation-style mansion tucked away behind a gate of wrought iron and towering hedges. Mark pulled his car over onto a gravel shoulder a quarter-mile from the entrance. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "What am I doing?" he wondered. "I should go home. I should call a lawyer. I should let her have this ghost life." But the image of Sarah laughing on their wedding day, the real wedding day, flashed in his mind. He needed to see it. He needed to see the woman he had loved for 5 years transform into the stranger who was about to commit bigamy. He left his suitcase in the trunk and began to walk. He kept to the shadows of the massive oaks that lined the perimeter of the estate. The air was loud with the rhythmic buzzing of cicadas, a sound that grated on his raw nerves. As he approached the back of the property, he found a break in the hedge near a line of service trailers. From his vantage point behind a thicket of palmettos, the scale of the deception became horrifyingly clear. The Magnolia Estate was a cathedral of wealth. A massive white tent had been erected on the rear lawn, its silk panels fluttering in the breeze. Workers were scurrying everywhere, carrying crates of crystal stemware, draping thousands of white orchids over a cedar trellis, and testing a sound system that piped soft, classical strings into the humid air. Then, he saw her. Sarah stepped out onto the wide, elevated veranda of the main house. She wasn't wearing the sensible navy blazer she'd left the house in. She was wearing a flowing, cream-colored sundress that caught the light, her hair tossed effortlessly over one shoulder. She looked radiant. She looked younger. She looked like a woman who didn't have a care in the world, let alone a husband in another state. A man followed her out. Julian Whitlock. Mark recognized him from the hidden iPad photos, but seeing him in the flesh was different. Julian was tall, with the effortless, athletic build of a man who spent his weekends on a yacht. He moved with an air of absolute ownership of the estate, ownership of the moment, and ownership of Sarah. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Mark watched, frozen, as Sarah leaned her head back against Julian's shoulder, a look of pure, unadulterated bliss on her face. Julian whispered something in her ear, and she let out a bright, melodic laugh, the same laugh she used to give Mark when he'd surprise her with breakfast in bed. Julian reached out and took her hand. Mark's eyes focused on her fingers. The gold band Mark had placed there 5 years ago was gone. In its place was a rock, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that looked like a small galaxy. "My God," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He realized then that this wasn't just a fling. This wasn't a mistake. Sarah had built a parallel universe. In this world, she was the future Mrs. Whitlock, a socialite in waiting, a woman of the low country. In his world, she was the hard-working marketing exec who complained about the mortgage and the leaky faucet. She had partitioned her soul, and Mark had been relegated to the smaller, gloomier half. He watched as a catering manager approached them with a tray of appetizers. Sarah picked up a small tartlet, fed a piece to Julian, and then kissed him deeply. It wasn't the chaste, hurried kiss she had given Mark at the Uber. It was passionate. It was hungry. Mark felt a surge of bile in his throat. He looked away, his gaze falling on a stack of printed programs sitting on a nearby equipment crate. He waited until the workers moved toward the tent, then darted out to grab one. The cover was thick, cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering. The wedding of Sarah Elizabeth and Julian Vance Whitlock. Saturday, May 14th. He flipped it open. The About the Couple section was a masterpiece of fiction. It spoke of their whirlwind romance that began 3 years ago in London, when Sarah was supposedly at a conference in Leeds. It mentioned Julian's late parents and Sarah's tragically deceased first husband who had died in a car accident years ago. Mark stared at the words. Tragically deceased. She hadn't just divorced him in her mind, she had buried him. To everyone at this wedding, he was a ghost, a memory of a man who no longer drew breath. It was the ultimate erasure. She hadn't even given him the dignity of being an ex. She had killed him off so she could have a clean slate. A cold, diamond-hard resolve settled over Mark's heart. The grief was still there, a howling void in the center of his chest, but it was being rapidly covered by a layer of frost. He wouldn't confront her now. He wouldn't make a scene in the bushes like a jilted stalker. He would wait. He would let her have her perfect rehearsal dinner. He would let her sleep one last night in her bed of lies. He walked back to his rental car, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked into a grimy, budget motel on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would ask questions about the man with the haunted eyes and the tuxedo bag. He spent the evening in the flickering light of the motel room, staring at the JW cufflinks. He thought about the 5 years they'd spent together. The time he stayed up all night taking care of her when she had the flu. The way he'd worked double shifts to save for their down payment. The way he'd trusted her every word. He realized now that Sarah didn't just love Julian, she loved the escape. She loved the version of herself she could be when she wasn't Mark's wife. "Well, Sarah," Mark said to the empty room, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Tomorrow, You get to meet the ghost of your past. He pulled his tuxedo out of the bag and began to brush the lint off the lapels. He checked his watch. 24 hours until the ceremony. 24 hours until the tragically deceased husband made his grand reappearance. As he lay down on the thin motel mattress, the sound of the Charleston crickets finally faded into the background, replaced by the steady, pounding rhythm of a man who was no longer seeking answers, only a final, devastating balance of the books. The Saturday sun rose over Charleston with a cruel, golden brilliance, casting long, elegant shadows across the cobblestone streets. For Mark, the morning was a blur of cold coffee and the sterile silence of his motel room. He spent 3 hours just staring at his reflection in the warped bathroom mirror, a razor in his hand, shaving with the surgical precision of a man preparing for a duel. He dressed slowly, pulling on the tuxedo he'd bought off a clearance rack, a stark contrast to the bespoke garments that would surely populate the Magnolia estate. He checked his pocket one last time. The JW cufflinks were there. His phone was fully charged. The video file, a high-definition recording of their wedding vows from 5 years ago, was queued up and ready. The infiltration. By 5:30 p.m., the perimeter of the Magnolia estate was a sea of luxury SUVs and vintage sports cars. Mark parked his rental sedan 3 blocks away, tucked behind a dumpster where it wouldn't be noticed. He walked toward the gates, his heart hammering a heavy, rhythmic thud against his ribs. The security was light, the kind of arrogance that comes with extreme wealth. They expected people to clamor to get in, not to sneak in. Mark simply lowered his head, adjusted his lapels, and followed a group of boisterous, suntanned men in silk boaties through the wrought iron gates. He was just another face in a sea of privilege. The transformation of the estate since the previous night was staggering. Thousands of white hydrangeas and orchids hung from the trees, their scent so thick it felt cloying, almost funereal. A string quartet played a melancholic arrangement of a modern pop song, the notes fluttering through the humid air like dying birds. Mark took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, using it as a prop to mask his face. He drifted toward the edge of the crowd, eavesdropping on the conversations that drifted through the garden. "She's just a miracle, isn't she?" a woman in a fascinator whispered to her companion. "After what she went through with the first husband, it's so rare to find a second chance like this. Julian is absolutely besotted." "A car accident, wasn't it?" the other replied, sipping her drink. "So young." Sarah said he was a good man, but a bit simple. "Not quite the match Julian is." Mark's hand tightened around his glass until he feared the stem would snap. "Simple. Dead." He wasn't just a victim of an affair, he had been rewritten into a tragic, mediocre backstory. Sarah hadn't just left him, she had euthanized his existence in the eyes of the world. The procession. As 6 p.m. approached, the guests began to take their seats on the whitewashed pews arranged on the lawn, facing a floral altar that overlooked the river. Mark didn't sit. He remained at the very back, leaning against a massive live oak, hidden by the sweeping curtains of Spanish moss. The music shifted. The quartet began the slow, regal crawl of a processional. Julian Vance Whitlock appeared at the front, standing beside a silver-haired officiant. He looked every bit the prince of the Low Country 10, confident, and wearing the very tuxedo that Mark's stolen cufflinks were meant to complete. He checked his watch, a smirk of anticipation playing on his lips. He was a man who won at everything, and today was his ultimate trophy. Then, the crowd rose. Sarah appeared at the top of the veranda. She was a vision in ivory silk, a Vera Wang gown that must have cost more than Mark's annual salary. Her veil was a mist of tulle that trailed behind her like a ghost. She looked breathtaking. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of guilt in her entire life. As she began her walk down the aisle, her eyes were locked on Julian. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She passed within 10 feet of Mark, her perfume that familiar scent of sandalwood and bergamot wafting over him like a memory of a life that had never happened. Mark felt a strange, cold detachment. The anger had crystallized into something sharper purpose. The objection. The ceremony was a masterpiece of romantic fiction. The officiant spoke of destiny and souls finding their way back to one another. Julian delivered his vows first short, arrogant, and filled with promises of travel and legacy. Sarah followed, her voice trembling with a practiced, cinematic emotion. Julian, she whispered, her voice amplified by the hidden speakers. When I lost everything, I thought my heart was buried forever. But you brought me back to the light. I promise to be yours, and only yours, for all the days of my life. If there is any person here, the officiant said, his voice dropping into the traditional cadence, who knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant cry of a marsh bird. It was the moment of the theatrical pause, the beat where everyone holds their breath before the celebration begins. Mark stepped out from behind the oak tree. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. The grass muffled his footsteps, but the movement caught the eye of a guest in the back row. Then another. A ripple of confusion spread through the pews like a physical wave. Sarah saw him first. The color drained from her face so rapidly it was as if a plug had been pulled. Her bouquet of white roses slipped from her hands, hitting the grass with a dull thud. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian frowned, stepping forward with a protective, territorial glare. Who the hell are you? Security. Mark didn't look at Julian. He looked only at Sarah. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a button. The sound system of the Magnolia Estate, designed to carry the sweet notes of a quartet, was suddenly hijacked by a different audio. A recording, 5 years old, filled the air. I, Mark Grayson, take you, Sarah Elizabeth, to be my lawfully wedded wife. The voice was younger, filled with a raw, honest hope that made the current Mark wince. On the giant LED screens flanking the altar screens meant to show a montage of Sarah and Julian's whirlwind romance, a video began to play. It was their wedding. The real wedding. There was Sarah, in a much simpler dress, laughing as Mark accidentally fumbled with the ring. There was the kiss. There was the toast from her father, the father who was currently sitting in the front row, looking at Mark as if he'd seen a corpse rise from the grave. Sarah. Julian's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He looked at the screen, then at the man in the cheap tuxedo, then at his bride. What is this? Who is this man? Mark reached the front of the aisle. He stopped 3 feet from the altar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing the diamond cufflinks. You forgot these, Sarah, Mark said, his voice calm and terrifyingly clear. And you forgot something else. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the elite guests who were now frozen in a state of collective shock. I'm the tragically deceased husband, Mark announced, a small, bitter smile touching his lips. But as you can see, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I'm just here to deliver a gift to the groom. He tossed the cufflinks at Julian's feet. Congratulations, Julian, Mark said. She's all yours. Just make sure you check her business trips. The math usually doesn't add up. The silence that followed was no longer a pause. It was an explosion. The explosion Mark had anticipated wasn't a sound of thunder or a scream, it was the deafening, suffocating weight of 300 elite guests holding their breath simultaneously. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, their bows frozen mid-air like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the wet, rhythmic slap of the river against the estate's stone dock and the distant, mocking cry of a loon. Julian Vance Whitlock stood as if turned to salt. He looked down at the diamond cufflinks glinting in the grass, his wedding gift, delivered by a ghost, and then up at the giant LED screens where a much younger, much more authentic Sarah was laughing into the camera, her hand entwined with the man currently standing in the aisle. "Sarah." Julian's voice was no longer a princely command. It was thin, reedy, and laced with a dawning, horrific realization. "Who is this?" Sarah didn't answer him. She couldn't. She was staring at Mark, her face a mask of primal terror. The perfect bride was gone, in her place was a cornered animal. Her father, a man who had treated Mark with cold indifference for 5 years, stood up from the front row. His face was a deep, mottled purple. "Mark? What is the meaning of this?" Sarah said the divorce was finalized 2 years ago. Mark turned his gaze to his father-in-law. "There was no divorce, Arthur. There were only business trips. There were only conferences in Chicago and seminars in Leeds. While she was building this fairytale with Julian, she was coming home to me on Sundays, eating the dinner I cooked, and sleeping in the bed we bought together." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. The word bigamy didn't need to be spoken, it hung in the humid air like a poisonous fog. Julian finally moved. He didn't reach for Sarah. He recoiled from her as if her white silk gown were made of fire. "You told me he died," Julian hissed, his eyes wide and wild. "You told me he was killed in a hit and run in Seattle. I paid for the memorial garden in your hometown, Sarah. I gave your mother a pension because you said his debts had ruined her." Sarah finally found her voice, but it wasn't the melodic lilt she had used for her vows. It was a jagged, desperate shriek. "Julian, listen to me. He's a stalker. He's obsessed. He's unhinged. I left him years ago, he just wouldn't let go." Mark didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply pulled a thick, manila envelope from the inner pocket of his tuxedo and held it out. "The marriage certificate," Mark said calmly. "Our joint tax returns from last year. And a GPS log from our home security system showing exactly when Sarah returned from her various trips to Charleston. It's all here. The math always balances, Sarah. You forgot that." Julian's father, the patriarch of the Whitlock Empire, stepped forward. He was a man who valued brand above all else. He didn't look at Mark, and he didn't look at Sarah. He looked at the security team that had finally reached the altar. "Get them out," the older Whitlock commanded, his voice like grinding stones. "Get all of them out. The wedding is over. Clear the estate. Now." Mark didn't wait to be escorted. He turned his back on the altar, on the weeping woman in the Vera Wang gown, and on the man who had tried to buy a life that wasn't for sale. He walked back down the aisle, his footsteps steady on the white runner that was now stained with grass and mud. Behind him, the chaos erupted. Julian was shouting. Sarah was wailing, a sound of pure, shattered ambition. The guests were scrambling for their phones, the wedding of the century becoming the scandal of the decade before the sun had even fully set. Mark walked through the wrought iron gates of the Magnolia estate. He didn't feel the triumph he had expected. He felt an immense, hollow lightness. It was the feeling of a man who had finally put down a heavy burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. He reached his rental car and sat in the driver's seat. He turned off his phone. He didn't want to see the missed calls from her parents, the frantic texts from her friends, or the inevitable, pathetic explanations Sarah would try to craft. He drove away from the river, away from the jasmine, and toward the airport. The autumn air in Seattle was crisp and clean, a far cry from the suffocating humidity of South Carolina. Mark sat in a small, minimalist apartment overlooking the Sound. His life was quiet now. He had changed firms, moved to a different neighborhood, and cleared his home of every trace of the woman who had lived a double life. There was a knock at the door. It was a courier. Mark Grayson? The man asked. Mark nodded and signed for a thick packet of legal documents. He sat at his kitchen table, a new table, one Sarah had never touched, and opened it. It was a settlement offer from the Whitlock family's attorneys. In exchange for a strict non-disclosure agreement and his signature on an uncontested divorce, they were offering a sum of money that would allow him to retire before he was 40. They wanted the ghost husband to disappear forever. They were buying his silence to protect Julian's political aspirations. Attached to the legal jargon was a small, handwritten note on cheap, lined paper. It was from Sarah. Mark. They've taken everything. Julian sued me for fraud. My parents won't speak to me. I'm staying in a motel in North Charleston, working at a diner. I didn't do it because I didn't love you. I did it because I hated being ordinary. I wanted to be the woman in the photos. I wanted to be the woman Julian thought I was. Please, tell your lawyers to accept the deal. It's the only way I can pay my legal fees. I'm sorry. Truly. Mark read the note twice. He looked at the "I'm sorry" and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even a spark of the old love. He realized that Sarah hadn't been living two lives, she had been living none. She was a vacuum, filling herself with whatever light was brightest at the moment. He picked up a pen. He didn't sign the settlement. Instead, he wrote a single sentence on a fresh piece of paper and put it in an envelope addressed to the Whitlock attorneys. Keep your money. I've already balanced the books. He signed the divorce papers not for the money, but for the freedom. He walked to the window and watched the ferries crossing the gray water of the Sound. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification for an upcoming business trip to Tokyo. He checked his suitcase, sitting ready by the door. It was a simple black bag, light and functional. He didn't check the Project Moon folders. He didn't look for hidden cufflinks. He just checked the weather, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door. As he locked the deadbolt, Mark realized the most beautiful thing about his new life. When he said he was going on a business trip, he was actually going on a business trip. There were no secrets in his luggage, and for the first time in 5 years, the man in the mirror was exactly who he claimed to be. The story of Mark and Sarah Grayson was over. The dead husband had finally started to live.